Hey guys, tonight, the story of a boy who ran away to a war that has no record of him. You already know the shape of this story. Not the shape. A boy, too young to enlist, writes a number on a piece of paper, lies to a recruiter, and runs toward the guns. He carries a drum instead of a rifle, because the drum is how an army keeps time when to wake, when to march, when to charge, when to bury. He comes home older than his years. America has always loved that boy. We built statues to him. There was a real one. His name was John Clem. He tried to enlist at 9, got turned away, followed a regiment anyway until the soldiers themselves chipped in to pay him, and by 12 he was the youngest sergeant in the history of the United States Army. The drummer boy was a true thing. By some counts, as many as 1 in 5 Union soldiers was under 18. Boys really did write 18 on the soles of their shoes, so they could look a recruiter in the eye and swear they were over 18. The story is real enough that it almost doesn't matter whether any particular version of it happened, which is exactly the problem. Because Laura Ingalls Wilder put that story in her very first book. She gave it to her favourite uncle. In Little House in the Big Woods, the gentlest book about American childhood ever written, she wrote that her Uncle George had run away to be a drummer boy in the army. When he was 14 years old, she wrote that he came back wild. She wrote that he stood in the dark outside her grandfather's house and blew an army bugle into the trees, and the army has no record of him. None. No enlistment, no muster roll, no discharge, no pension. His 2 older brothers signed up in the winter of 1865. Their names are right there in the files. George's name is not. The boy Laura turned into a soldier is the one Ingalls brother. The war never touched. So, hold those 2 things in your hands at the same time, because the whole night lives in the gap between them. In the book, a 14-year-old runs away to war and comes home a wild young man with a bugle. In the record, a 14-year-old stays home in Wisconsin while his brothers go, and then lives a life so quiet and so terrible that the only thing he ever left behind in his own handwriting is 3 months of a dying man's diary. This is boring history. What we do here is simple. We take one person, the famous story used as scenery, and we stay with them until the scenery turns back into a person. Tonight that person is George Whiting Ingalls, born in 1851, died in 1901, Laura's uncle, the drummer boy who never was. Settle in. Get comfortable. Turn the lights down. If a channel that does this helps you sleep, do me one quiet favour and subscribe. It's the only thing that tells the algorithm to keep these people from disappearing twice. Here's the thing I want you to keep. The small thing. The thing the whole story turns on. When Uncle George blew his bugle into the big woods, Laura wrote that the sound came back. From very far away, she wrote, "The sound came back, thin and clear and small, like a little bugle answering the big one. There was no other bugle out there. There was no one to answer. What came back was an echo, the woods throwing his own call back at him. Thinner, smaller, hollow. A boy blows a soldier's call he has no right to, into the dark, and the dark hands him back a reduced copy of himself. Remember that. The bugle that answers, and the answer that was only ever him. Because that is also exactly what the books did to George, and we are going to spend tonight finding out why. Start where the love is. It matters that we start where the love is, because everything that comes later only hurts if you first understand that this man was adored. In Little House in the Big Woods, there is a chapter called Dance at Grandpa's. It is, for a lot of people, the warmest chapter in the warmest book of their childhood. The Ingalls family travels through the snow to Grandpa's house in the Wisconsin woods for a sugaring off the late winter party when the maple sap runs, and the whole family gathers to boil it down into syrup and sugar, and to dance. Laura is small, 4, maybe 5 years old, and in the middle of the music and the firelight there is Uncle George. He is big. He is loud in the way that thrills a small child and worries the adults. He has a swagger. And when little Laura cannot keep her feet still, it is George who notices. He looks at her and laughs. Then he catches her by the hand and dances a few steps with her, the 2 of them, in the corner, away from the grown-up dancing. Laura wrote one line about it that tells you everything about how she felt. She liked Uncle George. That is the George the world got, the uncle who sees the kid in the corner, the one who laughs first and dances with the smallest person in the room. But read the chapter the way the adults in it are reading him, and a second George appears underneath the first, because the grown-ups are watching him a little too closely. There is a wariness around George that a 4-year-old wouldn't catch, but the writer, remembering it 60 years later, put right there on the page. George is wild. Pa says, since he came back from the war, and he shakes his head. Laura wrote that, too. He shakes his head, as if he were sorry, but it couldn't be helped. Sit with that sentence. It is doing a tremendous amount of work, as if it couldn't be helped. Pa is explaining his little brother to the room. He is also, gently, apologizing for him. George is too loud, too much, too wild, and the family has agreed on a reason. The war did it. The war is why George is the way he is. The war is the thing you point to when a young man frightens you a little, and you love him anyway. And then comes the bugle. When the supper is over, George goes outside. He stands in the snow, in the dark, at the edge of the big woods, and he lifts an army bugle to his mouth and he blows it long and loud. Laura wrote, the sound goes out over the trees, ringing, and the children go still, and then the woods answer. Far off, thin, small, a second bugle seems to call back. George turns to them, this big wild young man, and he says one of the few lines of dialogue Laura ever gave him. Listen, he says. Isn't that pretty? It is one of the most beautiful images in the whole series. A soldier's instrument, blown into a frozen forest, and the forest answering in a smaller voice. Children have fallen asleep on that image for 90 years. Here is what no one tells the children. An army bugle in the hands of a man who was in the army is a relic. An army bugle in the hands of a man who was never in the army is a costume. The same brass. The same notes, completely different objects. And we are going to spend this whole night learning which one George was holding. Because the bugle is the myth in miniature. The answer from the woods was an echo. There was no other bugler. The romance of the scene, a veteran calling out and the world calling back, is built on a sound that was only ever George's own breath, thrown back at him by trees that did not care. Laura, the small girl, heard a conversation. What was actually happening was a young man alone at the edge of the dark, listening to a hollow copy of himself and calling it pretty. Now, why would I say it like that? Why be so sure the war never happened when the book is so sure it did? Because the book is not a court record. The book is a memory, written down by a 65-year-old woman about a party she attended when she was 4, starring an uncle she loved. And memory, especially loved memory, is the single most beautifully unreliable document a historian ever has to work with. Laura was not lying when she wrote that George ran away to be a drummer boy. She was repeating what the family said. She was handing down the apology Pa made in the firelight. George is wild since he came back from the war. She had heard that sentence her whole life. She had no reason on earth to check it. We do. So, before we go forward, let me put the family in the room with you, because you cannot understand what George's life became without understanding the house he was born at the bottom of. George Whiting Ingalls was the 9th of 10 children. 9th. By the time he arrived, his mother had been having babies for 18 years. His father, Lansford, had already buried one. There were older brothers who were practically grown men when George was learning to walk, and one of those older brothers, 15 years older, a restless, dreaming, fiddle-playing young man, was named Charles. Charles Philip Ingalls, the one the world would learn to call Pa. That is the first thing to fix in your mind. The man at the centre of Little House on the Prairie Pa, the pioneer, the dreamer, the father of the most famous frontier childhood in American letters, was George's big brother, 15 years older, already looking west while George was still a baby in a Wisconsin cabin. And the distance between those two brothers, the one who left to chase the prairie and became a legend, and the one who stayed in the woods and became a footnote, that distance is the second thing this story is about. The drummer boy, and the brother who didn't leave. We have the myth now. We have the dance, the wildness, the bugle, the apology in the firelight. We have an uncle that a whole country fell asleep loving. Now, We go get the record. And the first thing the record wants to tell us is where George actually was during the war he supposedly ran away to. He was home, and his father was losing everything. Forget the bugle for a minute. Forget the swagger. Let's find out where a 10-year-old George Ingalls actually was in the winter the war began. He was watching his father lose the farm. When George was about 2, his father, Lansford, bought 80 acres on the Oconomowoc River in Jefferson County, Wisconsin. Good water, good intentions. The kind of land a man buys when he believes the next stretch of his life is going to be the one that finally holds. For a few years it almost did, and then it didn't. In January of 1861, the same month the country itself started cracking apart over secession, Lansford Ingalls lost his land. It was sold at sheriff's auction. The bank, the debt, the county, whoever held the paper, took the 80 acres on the Oconomowoc and sold them out from under the family while George stood there 10 years old and watched. That is the real backdrop of George's childhood. Not drums and glory, a sheriff's auction. The specific, quiet humiliation of a family that has to load what it still owns onto a wagon because the place it lived now belongs to someone who showed up with a deed and a constable. So, the Ingalls' moved. Lansford took the family to Pepin County and bought 80 more acres this time, right up against land already owned by his son James, because when you have lost everything once, you move next to your own kin, so that if you go down again, there is at least someone within shouting distance. And in that arrangement, in that huddle of Ingalls families on the Pepin County line, the Civil War happened around them. Now watch the dates, because the dates are the whole case. The war ran from 1861 to 1865. George was born in 1851. That means when the guns started, George was 9. When the guns stopped, he was 13. He wouldn't turn 14 until July of 1865, 3 months after Lee surrendered. The window in which a 14-year-old George could have run away to be a drummer boy is basically closed before it opens. The war was already ending by the time he reached the age the legend gives him. But here is the part that turns coincidence into something colder. His brothers did go. In January of 1865, the last winter of the war, 2 of the Ingalls boys enlisted in the Union Army. James, the older one, and Hiram, who was still only a teenager himself. They signed up. Their names went into the rolls. The paperwork exists. You can read it. George's name is not there. Not in James's regiment. Not in Hiram's. Not anywhere. The boy the book sent to war is the one Ingalls brother who, when 2 of his actual brothers actually marched off in the actual last winter of the actual war, stayed home. And I want you to feel what staying home actually meant, because the books never show you this side of a war, and it is the side George lived. A war doesn't only happen at the front. It happens, just as hard and far more quietly, in the houses the soldiers leave behind. When James and Hiram marched off in that last winter, the work they had done did not march off with them. It stayed, and it fell on whoever was left, the women, the old men, and the boys. A 13-year-old on a Wisconsin farm in the winter of 1865 did not get to be a child. He became the labour that 2 grown men used to provide. The wood 2 men used to cut, he cut. The stock 2 men used to keep alive through a winter that killed careless animals and careless people alike, he kept alive. War takes the strong backs and leaves the work, and the work does not care how old you are. Then there was the waiting. News from the front came late, and came wrong. A letter weeks behind the events it described. A rumour. A name on a list in a newspaper that reached the farms after the man it named was already in the ground. Every piece of paper that arrived could be the one. 2 brothers somewhere in the south, in the last and bloodiest stretch of the war, and at home a boy old enough to understand exactly what the lists were for, and too young to do anything but read them. That is its own kind of front. It is the front where you can't fight back, can't march, can't even see the thing that might be coming for the people you love. You can only do the chores and watch the road. So set the swagger and the bugle down for a second and put the real boy there instead, not a runaway hero. A frightened, overworked 13-year-old holding a farm together with a war on, waiting to find out which of his brothers were coming back. That boy did exist. The record all but guarantees it. He's just nobody's idea of a story. And that reframes the bugle completely, doesn't it? Because now the most likely true version of that scene at Grandpa's is almost unbearably human. Picture it. The war ends. James and Hiram come back, if they come back the way young men came back from that war. Which is to say, not all the way back. They have the coats, they have the stories. Maybe one of them has a bugle, and there is George, 13, 14, the kid who didn't go, the one who was too young, standing in a house suddenly full of brothers who crossed over into the most important thing that would ever happen to their generation and left him on the near side of it. What does a boy like that do? He picks up the bugle. He learns the swagger. He becomes, in the family's word, wild. Not because the war broke him, because the war happened to everyone but him, and a 14-year-old will do almost anything rather than be the only one in the room who wasn't there. I want to be careful here, because this is the place where a lazy storyteller starts inventing. I cannot tell you what was in George's head. The record does not give us his thoughts in 1865. What the record gives us is a Shape brothers who served, a boy who didn't, and a family that, decades later, remembered the boy as a veteran anyway. The record gives us the gap. The feeling I just described is me, the narrator, standing in that gap and telling you what gaps like this usually contain. Take it as that. A reading, flagged as a reading. But the bare facts underneath it are not a reading. They are documented. The brothers enlisted, George did not serve. And the bugle in the big woods, blown by a man who was never a soldier, calling out over the trees and getting back nothing but his own thinned-out echo that is not a sentimental detail anymore. That is the first time we catch the family in the act of making George into something he wasn't. Gently, lovingly. The way families do. There is one more fact from these years, and it's the kind of small thing that turns out to matter at the very end of the night. So I'm going to plant it now and walk away from it. George could write. He could read and write well enough that years later, when his soldier brothers needed someone to put their war on paper to testify, in writing, to what they had done and seen, it was George they used. Hold on to that. The brother who never went to the war is the brother who would one day be trusted to certify it on paper. We'll come back for that. We'll come back for it when it can do the most damage. For now, the war is over. James and Hiram are home. Lansford has moved the family again. He'd sell the Pepin land in 1868 and push on into Pierce County, and later still up into the deep woods of Burnett County, because the Ingalls men, all of them, every single one, seemed to have carried the same restlessness in the blood, the same conviction that the holding place was always one more move away. And George, not yet 20, no war to his name and no land of his own, went down to the water and got a job on a boat. Here is the truth about Lake Pepin. It is not really a lake. It is a wide, slow swelling of the Mississippi River, 20-some miles long, pressed out flat between the bluffs of Wisconsin and Minnesota. In the winter, it freezes hard enough to drive a team across. In the warm months, it is the thing standing between everyone on one side and everywhere on the other. And in the years right after the war, to get across it, you needed a ferry. You needed a man with a flat-bottomed boat who knew the current and the wind and the places where the bottom came up, who would take your wagon and your horses and your family from one shore to the other for a coin. Family stories say that man, for a while, was George. I have to flag that family stories say. This is not a census line or a deed. It is the kind of thing that comes down through descendants and gets written into the family record by the researchers who have spent their lives inside it. So hold it loosely. But hold it, because even as a story it tells you something exact about the shape of George's young manhood. While his big brother Charles was becoming Pa, while Charles was loading a covered wagon and pointing it at Kansas, at Indian Territory, at the open prairie that would become the most famous frontier in the world, George was running a boat back and forth across the same stretch of water. Charles crossed America. George crossed Lake Pepin. 20-some miles and back. 20-some miles and back. And there's a detail here that the Little House readers among you will feel in your chest, so let me give it to you. Lake Pepin is not just any water. It is the same wide stretch of the Mississippi that the Ingalls family crossed to begin the whole legend. When Charles loaded the wagon and took Caroline and the girls west out of Wisconsin, they crossed Lake Pepin on the ice, drove the team straight across the frozen lake toward Kansas and the Prairie, and the future that the books would make immortal. That crossing is in the story. It's one of the famous images of the whole saga. The family on the ice, the lake groaning under the wagon, the West waiting on the far shore. Now hold that against George. The famous family crossed Lake Pepin once, on the ice, going somewhere, going toward the story. George crossed it 1,000 times, on a flat-bottomed boat, going nowhere, back and forth, shore to shore, for a coin. The same water. One crossing became a legend. The other became a job. Charles used the lake as a door out of his old life and into the myth. George used it as a treadmill, taking other people toward their journeys while he stayed exactly where he was. A ferryman spends his whole working life moving people across a threshold he himself never steps over. He carries the travellers. He doesn't get to travel. There is no more exact image of George Ingalls than a man standing at the oars of a boat, ferrying other people toward the lives they're about to begin, and then turning the boat around and going back to the same shore he started on. That is not a small contrast. That is the entire difference between the two men's lives, drawn in one image. We do have one hard line from these years, and it's a plain one. The 1,870 census finds George in Rock Elm Township, Pierce County, Wisconsin, 19 years old. Living and working in the orbit of his father and his brothers, in the deep-folded farm country south of the river. No war record, no land. A young man doing the labour that young men without land did other men's fields, other men's harvests, a ferry in the season it ran. And I want to stop on the ordinariness of that, because the ordinariness is the point. This is the part of George's life that no book wanted, then or now. There's no drama in a young man labouring his way through his 20s in rural Wisconsin. There's no bugle in it. It is exactly the kind of life that gets compressed, in the family memory, into a single bright lie. He ran away to the war, because the lie is more interesting than the truth, and because the truth, frankly, is most of us. Most of us are George. Most of us cross the same water back and forth and watch a sibling or a cousin or a friend cross the whole ocean, and we tell ourselves a better story about our own quiet years because the quiet is hard to look at directly. But the quiet years are where George's real life was being decided, and it was being decided by the same force that ran the whole family, the inability to stay put and the inability to get ahead. Lansford kept moving Jefferson County, Pepin County, Pierce County, and finally up into Burnett County into the genuine North Woods, the cut-over pine land near the Minnesota border where the lakes have names like Devil's Lake and Mud Lake, and the winters are a different category of cold. The Ingalls men followed the same gravity. They were always going to the next place. They were always going to do better there. They almost never did. So, picture George at the end of this chapter of his life. Late 20s, strong, probably ferry work and field work build a body. Known around the county. The brother of the man off chasing the prairie dream, but himself still here, still crossing the same water, still landless. And by now, surely, feeling the thing a man feels when the years start stacking up and nothing has caught, the quiet pressure to begin, to marry, to build something of his own, to stop being the 9th child in someone else's story and start a story that was his. In 1876 he did. He found a young woman named Julia Bard. She'd come into the country from Michigan, the daughter of a family the Ingallses were already tangled up with. And in June of that year, George Ingalls got married. It should have been the beginning of the good part. The boat work behind him. A wife. The chance, finally, at a holding place of his own. It was the beginning of the part that destroyed them both. And the first sign of how bad it was going to get is hiding in the wedding itself, in who else got married that same day, and in how tightly this family kept marrying the same handful of people, over and over, until the bloodlines pulled close enough to leave a mark. On the 11th of June 1876, George Ingalls married Julia Bard before a justice of the peace in Alden, Wisconsin. He was 24. She was young, she'd been born in Michigan, in Eaton County, and come west into the same patch of Wisconsin where the Ingalls had piled up. A farmer marrying a girl from a neighbouring family. the most ordinary thing in the world. Except for who else got married that day. The same afternoon, before the same justice of the peace, Julia's sister married one of George's own kinsmen, a young man from the Clough side of the family. Related to George through his older sister Lydia, 2 Bard sisters, 2 Ingalls-connected men, 1 justice of the peace. One day. The researchers who have gone through the records think the 2 couples may well have stood up together. A double wedding, 4 people, 1 ceremony, the families folding into each other in real time. And that wasn't new, that was the pattern. This family married itself in tight little knots, over and over, until you almost need a diagram to keep the blood straight. Think about what was already true before George ever met Julia. His brother Charles Parr had married a Quiner girl, Caroline. His brother Peter married Caroline's sister Eliza, and a Quiner brother, Henry, married George's sister Polly. 3 marriages, 2 families, the same handful of people. The children those couples had weren't just cousins, they were double cousins, sharing twice the usual family blood because both of their parents were siblings of each other's parents. Now add the Bards and the Cards to that knot. George marries Julia Bard. Julia's sister marries a Clough cousin. Later, a Card brother marries George's youngest sister, Ruby. Round and round, the same few surnames, the same few farms, the same narrow circle of people marrying back into a circle that was already closed. I'm not raising this to make anyone a curiosity. Tight intermarriage was common in isolated frontier settlements when the nearest unrelated family is a hard day's travel away, and the railroad hasn't come yet. You marry who's near, and who's near is usually kin to someone you're already kin to. I'm raising it because it tells you how small George's whole world was. His brother Charles crossed half a continent and married into a future. George married the girl across the family, in the county he was born near, in a ceremony he may have shared with his own cousin. The horizon of his life was about 40 miles wide, and it was full of his own relatives. But on that June afternoon, none of that was sad yet. On that June afternoon, it was just a wedding. 2 of them. A man who'd spent his 20s running a ferry and breaking other men's ground, finally had a wife and the beginning of a household. He was farming now in Rock Elm Township, and he and Julia settled into a life in Alden. The land wasn't much and it wasn't his free and clear, but it was a start, and George was the kind of man you can feel it in the few traces he left who wanted, more than anything, a start that would hold. Let me put down a marker here because we're a good way into the night, and I want you oriented. We came in chasing a question. Why did Laura turn this man into a drummer boy who never was? We've established the lie and we've established the truth under it. The boy who stayed home, the young man who crossed the same water back and forth while his brother became a legend. Now we've brought him to the one moment where the truth looked, briefly, like it might turn out gentle. A wife, a farm, a start. Hold that picture of George in June of 1876, because it is the last time in this story he gets to be hopeful. Everything from here is the cost. And the cost begins, as it so often did in that century, in the cradle. I'm going to tell you what the family record says happened to George and Julia's children, and I'm going to tell it plainly, because it does not need any help from me to land, and because the people it happened to deserve to have it said without decoration. They had several children. The record does not give us all their names, and that absence is its own kind of grief children who were here and counted and then weren't, and whose names didn't survive even in the careful files of people who tried to keep everything. What the record says is that the babies died, several of them, shortly after birth, one after another. A child would come, and the house would fill with the enormous, fragile hope that fills a house around a newborn, and then the child would be gone. And George and Julia would do the thing that frontier couples did more often than we can stand to think about. They would bury it, and they would try again. And then one lived. One of their children lived a full year. Long enough to stop being a held breath and start being a person. Long enough to have a face that was becoming its own face. A sound. A weight in the arms that the arms learned. A year is long enough that you let yourself believe. A year is long enough that the fear in the back of every new parent's mind starts, finally, to quiet down. This one was going to make it. This was the one that held. One winter, they bundled him up to take him visiting to relatives, across the cold country the way families did, Wrapping a baby in every layer they had against a Wisconsin winter that does not forgive exposed skin, they wrapped him tightly. They wrapped him, the record says, too tightly. And somewhere in that bundle of wool and good intention, the baby smothered. The thing they did to keep him from freezing is the thing that took him. He died inside the protection. There is no way to say that which makes it bearable, and I'm not going to try. I'll only point at the specific cruelty of it, because the specific is where the truth lives. It would be one kind of grief to lose a child to a fever you couldn't fight, or a winter you couldn't keep out. It is a different and more haunting kind to lose the one child who lived, the one who'd already survived the dying that took the others, to an excess of care, to love, to wrapping him up against the cold. The parents did everything right, and the everything right is what killed him. I have to flag the sourcing on this, the way I've flagged things all night, because you've trusted me this far and I won't spend that trust. This account, the several infant deaths, the child who lived a year, the smothering comes down through the family history, assembled by the researchers who have spent decades inside the Ingalls records. It is not a coroner's report. I cannot show you a death certificate that says smothered. Take it as what it is, the family's own memory of its own worst winter, preserved because someone could not bear to let it disappear. But know this, the bare, hard, documented fact underneath the story is not in dispute. George and Julia Ingalls raised no surviving children. None. Whatever the exact sequence, the outcome is in the record in the plainest possible form. A marriage that produced children and a household that, in the end, contained none of them. Now hold that next to the man in the big woods, the laughing uncle. The one who saw the small girl who couldn't keep her feet still and danced with her in the corner. By the time Laura was writing that scene, she was an old woman and George was long dead, and she knew she had to have known. Families know what had happened to his children. She knew the man who danced with her had buried every child he ever made. And she gave him a bugle and a drummer boy story and a single bright line of dialogue, and she let him be, forever, the fun uncle at the party. I used to think the kindest thing you could say about that was that she was protecting him. I've come to think it's more complicated and sadder than that, and we'll get to it. For now, just hold the two Georges side by side, the one who blows the pretty bugle into the woods, and the one who watched his only living child die in his wife's arms inside the blankets meant to save him. Because the bugle scene is the myth doing exactly what myth is for. It is the family taking the most unbearable life in the family and handing it a costume so it can be looked at. George is wild since he came back from the war. No. George was wild, if he was wild, for reasons that had nothing to do with any war and everything to do with a row of small graves. Say it plainly, because the distinction matters, how common this was, and how uncommon. Child death was not rare on the 19th century frontier. Most families buried at least one to fever, to diphtheria, to the dysentery that swept through settlements, to the simple fact that there was no medicine for most of what killed children then. Even the famous family knew it. Charles and Caroline lost their only son, baby Freddie, before he reached a year. So in one sense, George and Julia were living the ordinary arithmetic of their time, and their neighbours would have understood the grief because most of them had carried some version of it. But there is a difference between common and survivable, and George and Julia landed on the wrong side of it. To lose a child was ordinary. To lose every child, all of them, one after another, including the one who had already beaten the odds and lived a year, was something else. It was the kind of loss that emptied a house completely, that left a marriage with nothing in it but the two people and the silence where the children should have been. The frontier had a rough, hard-won way of absorbing the loss of a child. It had no way at all of absorbing the loss of all of them. That is the difference between grief a person carries and grief that carries the person off. Julia got the second kind, and the grief did not stop at George. It went into Julia, and it did to her something that the 19th century had a particular terrible machine for handling. Within a few years of burying her children, Julia Ingalls would be taken from her home and committed to an asylum. And the paperwork for that, unlike the war George never fought, is real. In 1888, Julia Ingalls was committed to the Wisconsin State Hospital for the Insane at Mendota. I want to slow all the way down here, because this is the kind of fact that a careless telling races past, and racing past it would be a small betrayal of Julia. So let's understand exactly what that sentence meant in 1888, and let's be honest about what it almost certainly did, and did not, mean. Mendota was a real place. A large state asylum on the shore of a lake near Madison, opened in 1860. The kind of grand, grim institution the 19th century built when it decided that suffering minds should be housed somewhere out of sight. By 1888, it held hundreds of people. And the thing you have to understand about who ended up there is that the door swung in much more easily than it swung out, and it swung in especially easily for women. A woman in 1888 did not have to be what we would now call mentally ill to be committed. She had to be unmanageable. She had to be, in the language of the time, melancholic, or hysterical, or simply more grief than the people around her knew how to hold. The paperwork to put a wife into an asylum could be signed by a husband and a doctor, and the doctor did not need much. Grief that would not lift, crying that would not stop, a woman who had buried child after child after child, and then buried the one who lived, and who would not come back from that. In our century, we would call what Julia was carrying by other names: severe depression, complicated grief, trauma stacked on trauma, until the mind simply will not hold weight anymore. In her century, there was one name for it, and one address, and the address was Mendota. So the most likely truth, and I'll flag it as a reading again, because the record gives us the commitment, not the conversation that led to it. The most likely truth is that Julia Ingalls did not lose her mind so much as she ran out of the strength to perform having one. She had given birth and buried, and finally she could not stop grieving, and grieving without end was, in 1888, a committable offence. And so the woman who had already lost everything lost the last thing: her home, her freedom, the right to be sad in her own house, and was sent away to be sad in an institution instead. She did not come back. 5 years later, in the early 1890s, Julia was transferred from Mendota to another institution, the Dunn County Asylum for the Chronic Insane. Read that word, chronic. It is an administrative word, and it is a death sentence dressed as a diagnosis. It means not getting better. It means long term. It means the state had looked at Julia Ingalls and decided she was not a person who would be repaired and sent home, but a person who would be stored. She lived in that second asylum for years. She would not die until 1910, outliving George, as it happens, by nearly a decade. Which means that for the last 13 years of George's life, from 1888 until he died, his wife was alive, and committed, and gone. And I want you to sit for one more moment with what those 22 years actually were, because Julia is the second buried person in this story, and she deserves not to be rushed past either. The asylums of that era were not, for the most part, places of healing. They were places of storage, large, overcrowded, underfunded county and state institutions where people the world didn't know what to do with were housed, fed, locked in, and largely left. The chronic wards were the worst of it. Once you were labelled chronic, the small efforts at treatment mostly stopped, because the whole point of the label was that you weren't expected to improve. Women landed in those wards for things we would never institutionalise anyone for now: grief that wouldn't lift, the aftermath of childbirth, melancholia, moods their husbands couldn't manage, and once the door closed, it tended to stay closed. Julia went in 1888 and came out in 1,910 inches a coffin. 22 years. A woman in her 20s when grief took her, an old woman by the institution's standards when she finally died in it, having spent more of her life inside those walls than she ever spent in the home she'd made with George. We have her commitment papers. We have her transfer. We have her death. We do not have one word from her, not a letter, not a line, nothing. She is even more thoroughly erased than her husband, and there isn't even a children's book to blame for it. There's just the silence the century kept around its inconvenient women. And here is the detail that tells you what that did to George, the detail that comes from his own words, which will reach properly before the night is over. After Julia was taken away, George went back to being known, around the county, as a single man. Not a widower, she wasn't dead. Not a married man, she was never coming home. Something the language of the time didn't really have a word for. A man whose wife was alive and lost at the same time. He filed himself, quietly, back under single. Because what else do you write? What else do you say when someone asks? What else do you do with a marriage that has no wife in it and no end to wait for? Let me step out of the dark for 1 second. Because we've been in it a while and we've got a way to go. If you're still with me, if this is keeping you company tonight, do something for me down in the comments. Tell me where you're listening from. Your town, and the local time on your clock right now. I read them. There's something I find genuinely steadying about a few hundred people in a few hundred different darknesses, all keeping company with the same quiet story. Leave your town and your time, and then come back, because George is about to do the thing the Ingalls men always did when a life fell apart. He's about to move. He's about to go looking for a holding place. And he's going to go looking for it in the worst country in Wisconsin to look for one. When a man in the 1880s had lost his children and lost his wife to an asylum and had nothing left to hold him to the place where it all happened, the country gave him one clean way to start over. It was called the Homestead Act, and the promise of it was almost biblical in its simplicity. Go to the unclaimed land, file on a quarter section, live on it, and work it for 5 years. And at the end, the government would hand you the deed, 160 acres, yours, free, except for the 5 years of your life it cost to prove you deserved them. So, in the 1880s, George went north, up into Burnett County, into the cut-over pine country near the Minnesota line, and he filed a claim. And he didn't file it alone. His brother Hiram, the real soldier, the one who'd actually enlisted in '65, filed right beside him. The two brothers took claims in the same township, Oakland, and not just the same township, the same section. Section 35. Both of them. The veteran and the man the family pretended was a veteran, side by side on the same square mile of bad land at the end of the world. And I have to tell you about the land, because the land is the last cruel joke of George's life and you can still find it on a map. His claim sat northwest of where the town of Webster is now, in a low wet stretch wedged between 3 lakes, Mud Lake to the north, and Devil's Lake and Connor's Lake pressing in nearby. Think about that geography for a second. Think about what it means to be hemmed in on every side by water with names like that. Mud Lake, Devil's Lake. This was not the open prairie his brother Charles had crossed in a covered wagon, the big sky and the tall grass and the horizon you could ride at for a week. This was the opposite of that. This was a confined, swampy, lake-bitten corner of the North Woods, a piece of ground squeezed between bogs, the kind of claim a man takes not because it's good, but because it's left. Hold the two brothers in the same frame as the whole myth, because the contrast is the entire point. The legend the family told had George running away to a war, marching across a country in a blue coat, a boy at the great centre of his nation's great event. The truth had George at 40, a childless man with a wife in an asylum, dug into a square mile of swamp between Mud Lake and Devil's Lake, trying to outlast 5 winters on bad ground, so a government clerk would eventually hand him a deed. The drummer boy was supposed to be at the centre of everything. The real George ended up at the exact dead edge of everything, as far from the centre as the geography of Wisconsin could put him. But I don't want to leave you with only the bleakness of it, because there's something in this chapter that's almost tender, and it's the brother. It's Hiram. Because Hiram didn't have to file next to George. Hiram had been to the war, had his own life, his own family, his wife, whom the records call Lib, and a daughter, Ellen. Hiram could have homesteaded anywhere. Instead, he took the claim next door. He put himself one section away from his broken younger brother, in the same empty township, so that George, the childless one, the one whose wife was gone, the one with no one, would have someone within walking distance. The Ingalls men moved next to their kin when the world came apart. We saw Lansford do it after the sheriff's auction, buying land next to his son. Now we see Hiram do it for George. In a family that could not stop losing things, that was the one thing they reliably did for each other. They made sure that when you went down within shouting distance of your own blood. So, George spent his 40s on Section 35, proving up, putting in the years, living in a cabin on a confined piece of ground between the lakes, a mile from his brother, 100 miles and a whole life away from the woods where he'd once danced with a little girl in the corner. And somewhere in those years, the cough started. We know it started because, for 3 months near the end, George Ingalls wrote it down day after day, in his own hand. The same hand the family had once trusted to certify a war. That diary is the closest we will ever get to standing in the room with him. But before we can read what George wrote, you have to see where he was sitting when he wrote it. You have to see the small, cold, lonely world he'd ended up in, the world between the lakes. You have to understand what kind of country George moved into, because it explains the loneliness of everything that came after, and because it's the part of the frontier the famous books almost never show you. This was not Prairie. The little house world that millions of people carry in their heads is open grassland, the tall grass rolling to a flat horizon, the big sky, the sense of a continent lying open and waiting. That was Pa's frontier. That was Kansas and Dakota and the Great Plains his brother crossed. George's frontier was the opposite of all of it. Burnett County, in the far northwest corner of Wisconsin, was deep woods, and by the time George got there it was something even harder than woods. It was cut-over land. Here's what that means. The great northern pineries, the vast stands of white pine that had stood for centuries, had been logged off. The lumber companies came through, took the tall, straight pine, and left. What remained was a wreckage of stumps, sandy soil, brush, and swamp stretching for miles. And then men like George were sold, or given through the Homestead Act, the leftover ground with the promise that they could farm it. Mostly they couldn't, or not well. The stumps had to be pulled or burned, one at a time, by hand and horse. Brutal work that could take a man years to clear a few acres. The soil underneath was thin. The wet spots were everywhere between Mud Lake and Devil's Lake and Connors Lake. The water was always close, always seeping back into whatever you tried to drain. This was the land the country had left over, after the valuable part was hauled away, handed to the men who had nothing better, and George was one of those men. So, picture the isolation of it. A scatter of hard-up homesteads carved out of stump land, each family a long cold walk from the next. The winters running 5 and 6 months, the snow deep, the dark long. There was no town in any real sense nearby the village of Webster would grow up later, just south of where George's claim sat. There was just the settlement, a handful of families trying to wring a living out of cut-over ground at the end of the roads. And we know who they were because George wrote their names down. That last winter, in the diary we're going to read in a few minutes, the same names keep appearing, the men of his small world. William Penny, Abner Davis, Chester Keyser, L.H. Spafford, Alden Sawyer, plain northwards names, men whose own lives are footnotes inside a footnote, neighbours on bad land who borrowed tools and shared news and helped each other through winters that could kill you if you faced them alone. That was George's society now, not the famous frontier, 5 or 6 struggling families and the long white silence between their cabins. But there was one house that mattered more than all the others, and it was the reason George could stand it at all. Hiram's house, his brother's, a mile away, give or take, across the snow. And Hiram had a family in it, a wife, the record calls Lib, a daughter named Ellen, and Ellen's husband, a man named Marion Keyser, who'd married into the settlement. So Hiram's cabin wasn't just a brother's house. It was a household. A warm kitchen with people in it, a fire, a table, talk, the ordinary human noise that George's own house had been emptied of when his children died, and his wife was taken away. And that is the shape of George's last years, once you put it all together. One cold cabin of his own, with no one in it. One warm cabin a mile away, full of his brother's family. And a path between them through the snow that George walked and walked and walked. He'd go to Hiram's to eat. He'd go to Hiram's to warm up. He'd sit at the table and have long, quiet talks with Lib. His sister-in-law, the diary, shows them talking privately, again and again. And you can only guess at what a dying, childless man and the wife of his brother found to say to each other across all those winter evenings. His grief, probably. The cough. The weather. The dead. The God that frontier people argued with constantly. Whatever it was the closest thing to companionship George had left, and he walked a mile through Wisconsin winters to get it, and then he walked the mile back, alone, to the empty house. That's not the frontier of the books. There's no romance in it, no sweeping horizon. No fiddle by the fire, or rather, the fiddle and the fire are at the other man's house, and George is the one walking home from them in the dark. This is what the frontier actually was for most of the people who lived it. Not an adventure, but a hard, cold, lonely grind on bad land at the end of the world, kept survivable only by the few other people grinding it out beside you. George ground it out for years, proving up the claim, season by season, eating at Hiram's, pulling stumps probably when his lungs still let him, watching the water come back into the low ground every spring, getting weaker, and through it all, holding on to the one thing nobody could pull out of the ground or take to an asylum or bury in a small grave, his own stubborn, smiling refusal to let the dark have the last word. That was George's world. One warm kitchen, a mile of snow, a handful of hard-luck neighbours, and an empty house with a notebook in it. And in the winter of 1897, in that notebook, by lamplight, between the coughing, George Ingalls started writing it all down. It's time to read what he wrote. There is a diary. It covers 3 months, the 1st of January through the end of March, 1897. It has come down through the family of George's brother James, and for a long time nobody was completely sure who had written it, because the writer never signs a clean name to the whole thing. But the researcher who knows this family better than anyone alive went through it line by line, and the clues stack up so high in one direction that the conclusion is, in her words, almost beyond doubt. The man who wrote this diary lived on a confined piece of land between the lakes. He ate a great many of his meals at the home of a man named Hiram and a woman named Lib. He was close with their daughter Ellen and with Ellen's husband, Marion. He knew all the same neighbours George knew. And one night he wrote that he had been dreaming about Lafayette and the girls, and George Ingalls and his cousin Lafayette had married the 2 Bard sisters, the 2 girls, in that double knot of a wedding 20 years before. It is George. As near to certain as this kind of thing ever gets, the diary is George, which means that for these 3 months in the winter of 1897, we get something we get for almost no one this far down in the footnotes of history. We get the man's own voice, not the family's memory of him, not Laura's bugle, him. And I have to prepare you for what the voice is doing, because it is not what you'd expect from a story this sad. He's joking. The diary is, in large part, the record of a man coughing himself to death and refusing to be solemn about it. The consumption that would kill him in 1901 already had him by 1897, and he knew it, and his way of knowing it was to make grim, dry, almost cheerful little jokes into the page. He wrote, and I'm giving you his own words now, because his own words are the most valuable thing in this entire night. He wrote, I have coughed about 500 miles and still keep it up. I think that I will cough my liver out and get a wooden one. Read that again. Sit in it. A dying man, alone in a cabin in the Wisconsin winter, measuring his illness in distance, 500 miles of coughing, and then turning it into a joke about replacing the organ. He's coughing out with a wooden one, the way you'd replace a chair leg. There is more life in that one sentence than in the entire drummer boy myth. The myth gave him a bugle and a swagger, and made him a type. This gallows humour scratched into a diary by lamplight, this is a actual human being, and he is funnier and braver and more alive than anything the legend ever made him. There's another line. He wrote down something somebody had said about old Sutton and George Ingalls gossip. A bit of small-town talk that had gotten back to him, and his response to hearing his own name in other people's mouths was, Ain't that grand? I will get my name up yet if I keep on smiling. I will get my name up yet if I keep on smiling. That one stops me cold every time, because of everything George didn't know when he wrote it. He's a dying, childless, half-widowed man on a swamp claim, joking that maybe he'll make a name for himself if he just keeps grinning through it. And the punchline that he could never have seen coming is that he would get his name up. Not the way he meant. Not in his county, not in his lifetime. He'd get his name up in the most famous children's books in American history as someone else, as a drummer boy, as the fun uncle at the dance. He'd become one of the most widely read about minor figures of the whole frontier, and he'd never know it, and it wouldn't be him. The name that went up was a costume with his name sewn into the collar. The rest of the diary is the small machinery of a life being kept going one ordinary day at a time. The weather, the walk to Hiram's and back, the meals at his brother's table, the long private talks with Lib, the neighbours stopping by, Penny, Davis, the Keysers, all the hard luck names of the settlement, moving through the entries the way the living move through a sick man's days, bringing news, borrowing tools, sitting a while. It is, on its surface, the most boring document imaginable. A dying farmer noting down chores and visitors and the temperature, and that is exactly what makes it unbearable if you read it knowing what's underneath. Because under every flat little entry about the weather is a man who has buried all his children. Under every note about walking to Hiram's is a house he had to leave because there was no one in it. Under the jokes about the cough is the cough getting worse. Every week, in a body that used to pull a ferry across the Mississippi and now can barely cross a mile of snow. The diary's calm is not the calm of a man at peace. It's the calm of a man who has learned that if he writes down the cough and the chores and the weather, plainly, without flinching, he can get through one more day without letting the size of what's happened to him pull him under. The boredom is the bravery. The flatness is the fight. And then, on the 31st of March, 1897, the diary stops. We don't know why. Maybe he simply ran out of the notebook. Maybe spring came and the work picked up and there was no more time for sitting with a pen. Maybe the cough took a turn and writing got too hard. The record doesn't say. It just ends 3 months of a man's voice, and then nothing, the way a sound stops when a door closes. And here is the part that should stay with you. George did not die in 1897. He lived almost 4 more years after that diary stops. 4 more years of walking to Hiram's and back. 4 more years of that cough doing its slow work. 4 more winters between the lakes, and we have almost nothing from them. 3 months of his voice, near the start of the end, and then 4 years of silence, and then a grave. The single clearest window we will ever have into George Ingalls is 90 days of a man joking about his liver while he dies, and after that the door closes, and we only get to see him again when they put him in the ground. That's the whole tragedy of a life like George's, in one document. Not that it was sad, plenty of lives are sad. It's that almost none of it was written down. A man lived 49 years, and the sum total of his own surviving voice is 3 months of weather and coughing and grim good humour. Everything else, the children's faces, the day they took Julia away, what he felt crossing that water as a young man, what he and Lib actually said across all those winter evenings, all of it went into the ground with him, unwritten, the way it went into the ground with almost everyone who ever lived. The diary isn't valuable because it says a lot. It's valuable because it's nearly all there is. It's the one lit window in a house that's otherwise completely dark. That is the truth the bugle was covering. Not a wild young veteran. A dying middle-aged man, kept alive a little longer by the one brother who refused to let him be alone at the end, writing jokes into a notebook so the dark wouldn't win every single night. And the cruelest, sharpest irony of the whole story, the thing that, once you see it, you cannot unsee, is sitting in those same family files, a few folders over from the diary. Because George Ingalls' handwriting survives in one other official place, not a muster roll. He was never in a muster roll. It survives in the pension files of the war he never fought. And to understand why that is the hardest fact in this entire story, you have to understand what those files were, and what George did in them. Here is where the story closes its fist. After the Civil War, the men who'd served and the widows of the men who hadn't come home could apply to the government for a pension. A small, hard-won monthly payment in exchange for what the war had taken. But you couldn't just ask. You had to prove it. You had to prove you were who you said you were, that you'd served where you said you served, that the wound or the illness you were claiming really came from the army and not from the 30 years of farming since. And the way you proved it, in a world before easy records, was with witnesses, sworn statements, affidavits. You brought in people who could put their hand up and testify, in writing, under oath, that they knew you, that they knew your service, that the broken thing in you was the war's doing. And that system was enormous and slow and merciless about paper. The pension bureaucracy became one of the largest operations the federal government ran in the decades after the war. Special examiners, sworn depositions, neighbours and kin called to corroborate, files that grew for years as a veteran tried again and again to prove that his bad lungs or his ruined leg or his shattered nerves traced back to the army. A man could spend the rest of his life inside that paperwork, and the whole thing ran on exactly one thing: trustworthy witnesses, people whose word the government would accept, people who knew the soldier, knew the facts, and could write it down clearly and sign it and swear to it. Without those witnesses, a real soldier could be denied a real pension he had really earned simply because he couldn't prove it on paper. So when James and Hiram needed someone the government would believe, someone who could certify their service in a clear, steady, literate hand, they turned to the brother who had stayed home. They turned to George. The man who never wore the uniform became the man who vouched for the men who did. And his statements worked, because his word was good. Think about the strange dignity and the strange cruelty of that at the same time. In the one official dealing George ever had with the great war of his generation, his role was to be the honest man, the reliable man, the one whose signature carried weight. He was trusted completely. He was just trusted to testify about somebody else's life. George's brothers James and Hiram had both served. Both, in time, dealt with the pension system, that long bureaucratic afterlife of the war, where old soldiers spent decades proving and reproving that they'd bled for the country. And when they needed a witness, someone who knew them, someone whose word the government would take, someone who could write a clear, sworn statement and sign it in a steady hand, they used George. The man who never went to the war is the man who certified it. Let that sit. The brother the family turned into a soldier, the imaginary drummer boy. The bugle in the dark is, in the actual paper record of the actual war, not a soldier at all. He's the witness. He's the one standing just outside the event, close enough to swear to it, close enough that the government trusted his word about other men's service, and yet never once in it himself. His signature is in the war's files. His name is in the war's bureaucracy. But every single time it appears in the same role, the man testifying to what someone else did, the man who watched, the man just outside. And that right there is the truest image of George Ingalls in the entire record. Truer than the bugle, truer than the dance. Not a hero at the centre, a witness at the edge. A man whose whole life put him just outside the big thing, close enough to see it, close enough to swear to it, never once allowed inside it. His brother Charles got the Prairie and the legend. His brothers James and Hiram got the war and the pensions. George got to watch and to testify and to sign. And hold the two pieces of paper side by side, because the irony has a sharp edge once you do. On one side, the pension file where George's handwriting is steady and clear and trusted by the United States government no less, to certify under oath what real soldiers really did. That signature is the most official thing George ever produced. It's the government saying in effect, this man's word is good. We believe him about the war. On the other side, the children's book, where that same man is handed a war of his own, a bugle, a uniform, a drummer boy story. None of it true. So the war George actually touched, he touched as a truth-teller, a verifier, a man whose honesty the nation relied on. And the war George is actually remembered for, he never touched at all. The record trusted him to certify other men's reality. The legend repaid him by inventing his. He told the truth about a war and got remembered for a lie about one. If you wanted to design a single, perfect insult to a quiet, honest man, you could not do better than that. And nobody designed it, it just happened. The way these things happen to the Georges of the world, by accident and affection and the slow drift of who gets to tell the story. We've come a long way tonight, so let me hold the thread up to the light one more time before we go to the end. We started with a lie that felt like a gift. Laura's bugle, Laura's drummer boy. We found the boy who stayed home while his brothers marched. We followed him across Lake Pepin and into a marriage and into the worst grief a household can hold the children, every one of them. We watched the state take his wife and call her chronic. We found him on a swamp claim at the dead edge of the map, kept company by the one brother who wouldn't leave him. We read his own jokes about coughing his liver out, and now we've found his signature, the one piece of him the official record kept, and it's a signature on someone else's war. So when George Ingalls finally put the pen down, When the 500 miles of coughing finally caught up with the man counting them, what did the record give him? A grave. And even the grave, it turns out, he had to be given. Because George Ingalls did not die owning the ground he was buried in. His brother had to provide that too. The thing that killed George had a romantic name and a brutal way of working. They called it consumption because it consumed you. It ate you from the inside, slowly, over years, while you stayed upright and walking and joking as long as you could. We call it tuberculosis now. In George's century, it was the single biggest killer in America, so common that it was almost the background condition of being alive, and so drawn out that it gave its victims a terrible gift. Time to watch it happen. The 19th century told itself a pretty story about consumption, the same way it told a pretty story about everything that frightened it. In the poems and the paintings, the consumptive was pale and delicate and spiritual, wasting beautifully away on a chaise by a window, growing more soulful as the body grew thinner. That was the myth. The reality was the cough that wouldn't stop, the weight that fell off a man until his clothes hung on him, the night sweats that soaked the bedding, the blood that started coming up, the slow drowning of a man in his own lungs over months and years. The reality was a strong ferryman's body turning into something that coughed 500 miles and joked about a wooden liver because the alternative to joking was screaming. And understand what consumption did to a household, because it didn't just kill the person who had it, it moved into the house with them and stayed for years. There was no cure. There was no shot, no pill, no surgery, nothing a doctor in rural Wisconsin in the 1890s could do except tell a family what they already knew. The disease announced itself early and then took its time, and everyone around it had to watch it work. They watched the man get thinner. They watched him tire faster, cough longer, sweat through the bedding, bring up blood and then more blood. They learned the rhythm of it, the better days that fooled you, the bad weeks that didn't. And they knew, the whole time, how it ended, because they had almost certainly watched it end this exact way in some other house already. Consumption was so common that most people had a map of it in their heads. They could look at George in 1897 and see February of 1901 coming. There was a darker thing under it too, and it sat at Hiram's table every time George came to eat. Consumption spread. People didn't fully understand how the science was just arriving, but they knew, in their bones, that the cough could travel from the sick to the well, that sharing a room and a table and a closeness with a consumptive carried a risk. So every meal George ate at his brother's was also a small act of courage on both sides. Hiram and Lib kept setting the place. They kept letting the coughing man into the warm kitchen, kept sitting across from him, kept choosing his company over the safety of his absence. That, too, is in the shape of the record. The one warm room left in George's life stayed open to him, even though the man in it was, in the plainest sense, dangerous to be near. They loved him more than they feared the cough. Not everyone in that century got that. George did. We know George had it by the winter of 1897 because the diary is full of it. We know it took 4 more years to finish him. 4 years. Think about the arithmetic of that against everything else we know. By 1897, his children were already in their small graves. His wife was already 9 years gone into the asylums. He was already alone on the claim between the lakes, already walking the mile to Hiram's table and back. And on top of all of it, his own body had started the slow business of consuming itself, and he had 4 years left to feel it do that, mostly alone, in the cold. He spent those years the only way he could, proving up the claim, eating at his brother's, coughing, writing it down when he could still hold the pen and the humour, watching the seasons come around over Mud Lake and Devil's Lake, the freeze, the thaw, the brief green, the freeze again and getting weaker through each turn of it. On the 15th of February, 1901, George Whiting Ingalls died. He was 49 years old. The cause, in the plainest words the record uses, was consumption. The boy the book sent to war died in a bed in the northwoods of Wisconsin, of a disease that took its time, having buried every child he made and outlived, in every way that mattered, the marriage that made them. 49. Stop on the number for a second, because the comparison is its own quiet indictment. George died first. I quote, "His older brother Charles, the man the world would one day call Pa, outlived him. Charles wouldn't die until June of 1902, about 16 months after George, at the age of 66, in De Smet, the Dakota town the family had helped settle, with his wife Caroline and his grown daughters near him. And here is the part that matters, the part that undoes the whole legend. When Charles died in 1902, he was not famous. Pa Ingalls was not yet Pa Ingalls. The books that would make him one of the most beloved fathers in American memory were still 30 years away, sitting unwritten in the head of a daughter who hadn't started them. So the two brothers who began in the same Wisconsin cabin both died, a year and a half apart, as ordinary unknown men, one in a town surrounded by family, one on a claim between two lakes with a wife in an asylum and not a single living child to stand at the bed. The fame came later. It came to only one of them. And the reason why is the cruelest fact in this story, and we'll get to it. And then there was the question that the death of a landless, childless man always raised in that country. The practical question that grief doesn't have the luxury of ignoring. Where do you put him? Because George did not die owning very much. The whole story of the Ingalls men was the story of land that wouldn't hold Lansford's farm sold out from under him at the sheriff's auction. The moves from county to county chasing the next holding place. That was always one move away. George had spent his last years proving up a homestead, but a homestead is a hard, slow thing. And a man who dies in the middle of his life does not necessarily die with the deed in hand and a family plot bought and waiting. George died the way he'd lived at the edge, without quite enough. So, the family did the last thing this family always did for its own. Somebody provided. And the somebody, one more time, was Hiram. There is a small cemetery in the woods of Burnett County, east of Devil's Lake. It's called Orange Cemetery, and it exists because Hiram Ingalls gave the land for it. Read that plainly, because it's the kind of fact that slides past if you let it. The ground that the local dead were buried in the ground George was buried in was a gift from his brother. Hiram, the real soldier, the one who'd taken the claim next door so George wouldn't be alone, donated the very earth that the cemetery sits on. So when George died, there was somewhere to put him. And the reason there was somewhere to put him is that his brother had already thought of it, had already given the land, had already, in effect, made sure that the one thing George would absolutely need at the end, a place to lie down for good, would be there waiting, free, provided by blood. And who else is in that ground? Lansford. And Laura. Not Laura the writer, Laura the grandmother. Laura Colby Ingalls, George's mother, and Lansford Ingalls, George's father. The parents. They're buried in Orange Cemetery too. And here is where the whole night closes a circle so quietly that you could miss it, so I'm going to stop and make sure you don't. The most famous scene George ever appears in the dance, the bugle, the warmth, the little girl spinning in the corner happened at Grandpa's house. That's the name of the chapter, Dance at Grandpa's. And Grandpa in that chapter, the man whose house held the music and the firelight and the sugaring off, is Lansford Ingalls, George's father. So the dance that made George immortal happened in his father's house. And now, at the end, George is buried in his father's cemetery in ground his brother gave a few feet from the man whose house he once danced in. He started at Grandpa's and he ended at Grandpa's. The bright beginning of the myth and the dark end of the truth are the same address. The boy who danced at his father's house lies in his father's ground. Everything in between, the war he didn't fight, the water he crossed and recrossed, the wife, the children, the cough. All of it happened in the space between one room in Lansford's house and one plot in Lansford Cemetery. He never really got out of his father's orbit at all. None of them did. And Julia? Julia is not there. When Julia Ingalls finally died in 1910, 9 years after George, she died where the state had stored her in the Dunn County Asylum, the institution for the chronic, the place she'd been transferred to when they decided she would not get better. She had outlived her husband by almost a decade, in confinement, a widow who'd been made a widow in every way but the legal one years before he actually died, and she was buried away from him. The marriage that began as a possible double wedding, 2 Bard sisters and 2 Ingalls men standing up together on a June afternoon, ended with the husband in his father's cemetery in Burnett County and the wife in the ground near an asylum in Dunn County, two separate corners of Wisconsin, the distance between them the exact measure of everything that had gone wrong. So that's the grave, a man in his father's cemetery, on his brother's donated land, his children in their own small plots, his wife buried 60 miles away beside the institution that held her, a family blown to the corners of one state by grief and bad land, and a century that had no mercy for people who simply could not catch a break. Now we have the whole record, every piece of it. The boy who stayed home, the ferry, the marriage, the children, the asylum, the swamp claim, the diary, the pension files, the wasting death, the borrowed grave. We have, in front of us, the actual life of George Whiting Ingalls, assembled from census lines and family memory and his own coughing jokes and the deeds to a cemetery. Which means we are finally ready to ask the question we came here for, the real one. Not what happened to George. We know what happened to George now. The question is why the woman who knew exactly what happened to George chose to tell the world something else. Why Laura Ingalls Wilder, the most trusted voice in American childhood, looked at this life, the graves, the asylum, the cough, and decided that what the world should remember was a bugle in the dark. To answer that, we have to leave George's grave and go to a farmhouse in Missouri in the year 1930, where an old woman is sitting down to turn her family into a story. Before we go to Missouri, I want to pull the camera back because George Ingalls is not actually rare. That's the part that should bother you. George is not a freak case, a one-off, a strange dark corner of one famous family. George is the rule. He's just the rule with a paper trail, because he happened to be born next to people who got written about. Think again about the drummer boy, the real one, John Clem, and all the boys like him. The romance of that story is exactly that. It's exceptional. The 9-year-old who follows the regiment, the 12-year-old sergeant. We remember Clem precisely because almost no one's life looked like Clem's, but underneath that one bright story were hundreds of thousands of ordinary boys and men, and behind every soldier who got a statue were a dozen who got nothing, who served and came home and farmed and coughed and died, and left no trace except a name on a census line and a stone, if they were lucky enough to afford a stone. By some counts, as many as 1 in 5 Union soldiers was under 18. That's an enormous number of boys. We built the legend around one of them and let the rest dissolve. And George wasn't even one of those. George was a layer further down. He's not the forgotten soldier. He's the man who didn't even get to be a forgotten soldier. The brother who stayed home, the one the war happened next to, the one whose entire claim on the great national event is that he later signed his name as a witness to other men's part in it. If history barely remembers the boys who served, what chance does it give the boy who stayed? None. That's the answer. None. And that's why this channel exists. Honestly, because the official story of any era is built out of a handful of people standing on a mountain of Georges. Every famous family has one. Every dynasty, every legend, every beloved story you grew up on is standing on the quiet, uncounted lives of the people who were nearby and didn't make the cut. The sibling who didn't invent anything, the wife who isn't in the painting, the brother who farmed the bad land, while the other brother crossed the prairie and became pa. You know one. Maybe you are one. Maybe you're the one in your family who stayed in the town, stayed near the parents, took the job that held things together while a brother or a sister went off, and became the story that gets told at reunions. Maybe you felt that specific quiet thing, the thing George must have felt standing in a house full of brothers who'd been to the war, that the big event happened to everyone but you, and that you're expected to be glad to have been spared it, and that being spared it feels somehow like being left out of your own life. That feeling is old. George had it 150 years ago in a Wisconsin cabin. The blue coat in the corner was somebody else's. The bugle was a borrowed one. And the world that loved his brother had no slot for him at all until a writer needed a fun uncle for a party scene and reached into the family and pulled out George and put a costume on him. So, when we ask why Laura did that, we're not really asking a question about one writer and one uncle. We're asking the question this whole channel is about. What do the famous stories do with the people they don't have room for? Do they leave them out, Or do they do something stranger and keep them in, but only as scenery, only in costume, only as the thing the real characters dance with for one warm chapter before the story moves on without them? In George's case, it's the second one. She kept him in. That's what makes it haunting instead of just sad. Laura didn't forget George. She remembered him so well that she could write the exact tilt of how he danced with her, the exact sound of his bugle, the exact shake of Pa's head. She remembered everything, and then she chose what to keep. To understand that choice, you have to go to the farmhouse where she made it. You have to go to Missouri, in the worst year of the worst decade, and watch a woman in her 60s decide what her family was going to be allowed to be forever. In 1930, Laura Ingalls Wilder was in her early 60s, living on a farm called Rocky Ridge in the Missouri Ozarks, and the country was falling apart around her. The stock market had collapsed the year before. The depression was settling in like a long winter that wasn't going to thaw. Laura and her husband Almanzo had already lost much of their savings. And in that pressure, money pressure, age pressure, the sense of a whole world and a whole generation slipping away, Laura sat down and began to write her childhood. She started with the truth, actually. Her first attempt was an autobiography, a plain account of her pioneer girlhood that she called Pioneer Girl, and it was, by the standards of the warm books that came later, startlingly dark. It had the violence and the death and the despair that frontier life actually contained, and every publisher in New York turned it down. Nobody wanted it. It was too bleak, too unshaped, too much like life. So Laura, with the help of her daughter, Rose herself a professional writer and a hard, skilled editor, took that raw, true material and began to reshape it into something else. Something a family in 1932 could read to a child by lamplight and feel better, not worse. Something warm. And in 1932, the first of those reshaped books came out. Little House in the Big Woods, The Dance, The Bugle, Uncle George. Be precise about what reshape meant, because the warmth in those books was not an accident. It was built deliberately by two professionals. Rose Wilder Lane was not a casual helper. She was one of the highest paid magazine writers in America at the time, a hard editor with a sharp commercial sense for what readers would pay for, and she went through her mother's raw material the way a sculptor goes through. Stone cutting, smoothing, deciding what stayed and what fell to the floor. The despair got cut. The dead babies that filled the real frontier got cut or softened. The violence got managed. What was left was selected for warmth, for comfort, for the feeling a parent wanted to hand a child at bedtime. That is not a criticism of their craft, it is their craft. And it works so well that the books have never gone out of print. But it means that when Uncle George came out the other side of that process as a charming drummer boy, it wasn't a slip of memory. It was an editorial decision made by two skilled people who knew exactly how to choose warmth over truth and make the choice invisible. George wasn't softened by accident. He was softened on purpose, by experts, for a reason. Now hold the dates together, because they're the whole answer. Laura is writing the warm version in 1930, 1931, 1932. George had died in 1901. Julia would die in 1910. By the time Laura sat down to make her uncle into a fun drummer boy at a party, George had been in his borrowed grave for 30 years and Julia had been in hers for 20. Laura was not a child writing in real time, innocent of what came later. She was an old woman who had watched the whole thing unfold and now got to decide how it would be remembered. She knew about the children. She knew about the asylum. She knew George had died alone of consumption on a swamp claim. She knew all of it. And she chose the bugle. I don't think she chose it out of cruelty, and this is where I want to be careful, because it would be easy and cheap to turn Laura into a villain here, and the truth is more human than that. Put yourself in that farmhouse in 1932. The country is in agony. You are trying to make something that gives people comfort, and, not incidentally, something that earns money your family badly needs, because the warm books would sell and the bleak autobiography wouldn't. You are writing for children, and you reach back into your memory for your Uncle George, and what do you do with him? Do you tell the 4-year-old reader the truth that the laughing man who danced with you, buried all his babies and lost his wife to an asylum and coughed himself to death alone? Or do you give the child the dance and the bugle and the pretty sound coming back through the trees and let George be, forever, the warm thing in the warm chapter? She gave them the dance, and you can understand why. You can even call it mercy, mercy toward the reader, and maybe mercy toward George, who in death finally got to be the bright uncle instead of the broken one. Maybe turning him into a drummer boy was the only gift Laura had left to give a man the world had given nothing to. There's a version of this where the lie is the kindest thing in the whole story. But understand what the kindness costs, because a kindness can erase a person just as thoroughly as cruelty can. When Laura chose the bugle, she didn't just spare the reader the graves, she buried them again. She took George's real life, the actual, documented, devastating life of a man who deserved to be known, and she sealed it under a children's book costume, so charming that for 90 years, no one looked underneath. Millions of people have met George Ingalls. Millions. He may be the most widely encountered member of the entire Ingalls family after the household itself. And almost none of them know a single true thing about him. They know a drummer boy who never was. The kindness and the erasure are the same act. She kept him visible and made him invisible in the same sentence. That's the thing about a myth. When it's done with love, it doesn't fight the truth. It replaces it, gently, with something easier to hold, and then it sits on top of the truth so warmly and so long that the truth underneath goes quiet, not contradicted, just covered. Forgotten under affection. The most effective way to erase a man, it turns out, is not to leave him out. It's to keep him in costume, in the warmest chapter, where no one will ever think to dig. So now we can name exactly what happened to George, in the 3 plain layers it happened in. And once you see the 3 layers, you'll never read that gentle chapter the same way again. Stand the 2 brothers next to each other one last time, now that you know how both of their stories end, because the comparison says something about memory that I can't get out of my head. Charles and George started in the same cabin. Same mother, same father, same restless blood, same Wisconsin woods. Charles was 15 years older, which is a lot, but they were cut from the identical cloth, both of them dreamers, both of them convinced the holding place was one more move west, both of them men who loaded wagons and chased land. And here is the part nobody says out loud, because the books taught us to see only one of these men clearly. Charles failed almost exactly as much as George did. Read Pa's real life, not the warm version, and it's a chain of losses that would look familiar to George. Charles took a claim in Kansas in Indian Territory, on land that wasn't legally open and had to abandon it. He tried Plum Creek in Minnesota, and the grasshoppers came and ate the wheat down to the dirt 2 years running. He ran a hotel, he did carpentry, he took whatever work held the family together through one near disaster after another. He moved his wife and daughters from Wisconsin to Kansas to Minnesota to Iowa and back to Minnesota and finally to Dakota, chasing the same thing George chased and missing it almost as often. The pioneer father of American legend was, in plain economic terms, a man who spent most of his life not quite making it. The difference between Charles and George is not that Charles succeeded. Neither of them really did. Both men were beaten, over and over, by the same bad luck and the same impossible country. So why is one of them immortal and the other a footnote we had to dig up tonight? One reason, Charles had a daughter who lived, and that daughter could write. That's it. That's the whole difference. It isn't merit. It isn't that Charles was braver or wiser or worked harder or loved better. It's that one of Charles's children survived to adulthood, and that child happened to be Laura, and Laura happened to have the gift and the grit to turn the family's hard, failing, ordinary frontier life into the most beloved books in America. Charles got remembered because a child of his lived long enough to remember him. The legend of Pa Ingalls is, at bottom, an accident of which babies survived. And now look back at George with that in your hands, because it's the cruelest arithmetic in this whole story. George's children all died. Every one. And so George lost more than his sons and daughters. He lost his only possible path to being remembered the way his brother was. In this family, immortality came through a surviving child with a pen. Charles had one, George had none. The same catastrophe that emptied George's house of children also guaranteed that no one would ever write his life from the inside with love, the way Laura wrote her father's. The dead babies took everything from George twice, once when they died, and once more across the next century, when their deaths meant there was no one left to make him a legend. So, the two brothers went into the ground about 16 months apart, and here is the part that should stop you cold. Neither of them died famous. George went first. In February of 1901, at 49, on a swamp claim, his children in their graves, his wife in an asylum, his plot provided by a brother. Charles went next, in June of 1902, at 66, in De Smet, the Dakota town the family had helped settle, with Caroline and his grown daughters near him. Two ordinary men, gone within a year and a half of each other, both of them unknown to the wider world. The legend of Pa Ingalls did not exist yet. It would be born 3 decades later, in a Missouri farmhouse, out of a daughter's memory and a daughter's pen, and George had no daughter left to do the same for him. Same cabin at the start. Same restless blood. Same losing fight against the same hard land. The thing that decided which brother became immortal and which became a footnote wasn't character, and it wasn't even how they died. It was which of them left behind a child who lived long enough to write. That should unsettle you, because it means the famous version of the past isn't a record of who mattered. It's a record of who had a survivor willing to write. Everyone else, every George, just disappears. Not because they did less, but because the people who could have remembered them died first. There's one more thing the two brothers shared, and it's the thing the books quietly turned from a flaw into a virtue, depending on which brother had it, which tells you almost everything about how legends get made. The restlessness. It came from the father. Lansford Ingalls could not hold ground. We've watched it happen already. The 80 acres on the Oconomowoc River lost to the sheriff's auction when George was 10, then the move to Pepin County, then the sale of that and the push into Pierce County, then deeper still into the cut-over woods of Burnett County. Lansford spent his life moving toward a better place that kept not being there, and he passed that gravity down into all his sons. Charles had it, George had it. They were their father's boys, every one of them always about to start over somewhere new, always certain the next claim was the one that would finally hold. Now watch what the storytelling does with that single inherited trait. In Charles, it's called the pioneer spirit. It's heroism. When Pa loads the wagon and points it at the horizon, the books make it the most romantic thing in the world. The restless, questing, never-satisfied heart of the American frontier. A man too big and too free for any one piece of ground. We teach children to admire it. We name the whole genre after it. The exact same behaviour leaving good enough land to chase better land that isn't there. Dragging a family from county to county, never holding, never arriving in Charles. It's a virtue so powerful it carried him into legend. In George, the identical trait is just failure. A landless man who couldn't settle. A ferryman who never owned the river. A homesteader on bad ground who died before he proved up. Nobody writes a beloved book about George's restlessness. In him, the family gravity looks like what it materially was. A man who never managed to hold anything, blown from a Wisconsin cabin to a swamp claim by the same wind that the books, when it blew his brother, called destiny. Same blood, same trait, same father. One version gets a statue, and one version gets forgotten, and the only thing that decides which is whether the ending came out famous. That's not history. That's storytelling dressed up as history, and it runs one direction. It flatters the lives that happen to end in legend, and it quietly disappears the identical lives that didn't. I think this is the thing I most want you to take from George's life. More than any single date or grave, we are extremely confident, as a culture, about who the heroes were and who the nobodies were. We are sure Pa was special and George was minor. But strip the storytelling away and you find two brothers with the same heart, the same flaws, the same losses, and the same restless inherited gravity, and the difference between the hero and the nobody turns out to be luck. Which babies lived. Which brother got a writer. Which losing life happened to end inside a story somebody wanted to tell. George got the other kind of ending. The kind with no writer, no surviving child, no legend, just the record, waiting in the files for somebody to finally come and read it. So, let's do the thing this whole night has been building toward. Let's lay the made-up George and the real George down side by side, one final time, and name exactly what was done to him in the 3 plain layers it was done in, and, harder, name who it was done for. Every buried life has 3 layers, and George's are unusually clean, so let me lay them out one on top of the other, because seeing them stacked is the only way to feel the size of what happened. The first layer is the myth. The myth is short and it is lovely. A boy of 14 runs away to the Civil War to be a drummer boy. He comes home wild. He has a swagger and an army bugle, and one winter night at his father's house he stands at the edge of the big woods and blows that bugle, and the trees answer, and a little girl who loves him falls asleep on the memory. That is what tens of millions of people know about George Ingalls. It is the only thing they know, and almost every word of it is wrong. The second layer is the record. The record is long and it is merciless. A boy stays home while his brothers go to the war. He grows up landless, running a ferry across the same stretch of river over and over while his famous brother crosses a continent. He marries a girl from Michigan in a tangle of family weddings. They have children, and the children die several at birth, and the one who lived, the one who made it a whole year, smothered in the blankets meant to keep him warm. The grief takes the wife. The state takes her after that, first to one asylum and then to another, the second one labelled chronic, and she dies there years later, separated from him in death the way she'd been separated from him in life. The man files a homestead claim on bad swampland between 2 lakes at the edge of the map, beside the one brother who wouldn't leave him. He gets consumption. He spends his last years coughing, joking about it in a diary because joking is the only medicine he can afford, walking the mile to his brother's table and back. He dies at 49, owning so little that his grave has to be provided by that same brother who donated the land for the cemetery. And the only place his own signature survives in any official record of his country is in the pension files of the war he never fought, where he appears over and over as a witness to what other men did. The gap between those 2 layers is the whole story. The man the books made a soldier is the single Ingalls brother the war never touched. The warm uncle at the party is a man whose life was one of the most quietly catastrophic in the entire family. Hold the bugle in one hand and the asylum paperwork in the other, and the distance between them is the exact thing this channel was built to measure. And then there's the third layer, the one most people never think to look for, and it's the most important, the silence. Not what was made up, and not what was true, but why the made-up version is the one that survived, who kept it, and who it served. The clean version survived because Laura wrote it, and Laura loved her family, and Laura was making warm books in a cold decade for readers who needed warmth, and for a household that needed the money those warm books would bring. The true version, the dark one, the real one she'd actually tried to tell first, in her plain autobiography, and the world had refused it. Nobody would publish the graves. Nobody would buy the asylum. The market wanted the dance, so Laura gave it the dance, and the dance is what lasted. The silence around the real George wasn't a conspiracy. It was something quieter and harder to fight. It was a warm story doing so well, and sitting on top of the truth so gently that for 90 years nobody had any reason to lift it up and look underneath. The truth wasn't suppressed, it was outsold. So here, finally, is the answer to the question we walked in with. Why did Laura Ingalls Wilder give her Uncle George a war he never fought? Because the truth about George could not live in a children's book in 1932, and because a borrowed war may have been the only honour anyone had left to give a man. His country and his century had given nothing to. She couldn't give him back his children, she couldn't give him back his wife, or his health, or the land that never held, or the legend his brother got instead of him. So she gave him a bugle, and a brave story, and a permanent seat at the warmest party in American literature. It was a gift. It was a theft. In George's case, those turned out to be the same thing, handed over in the same gentle sentence, and the proof that they were the same thing is that you had never heard a true word about him until tonight. There's one piece of George left that we haven't given back to him. It's the thing he actually wanted. He wrote it down himself, in that cold cabin, coughing his 500 miles. And it's time he had it. I will get my name up yet if I keep on smiling. That's George. His own hand, his own words, written by lamplight in the winter of 1,897 inches, a cabin between the lakes, a dying man making a joke that was also, underneath, the most ordinary human wish there is. I will get my name up yet. I will amount to something. I will be known. Somebody, someday, will say my name and mean me. It is almost unbearable to read that line knowing what we now know, because the joke came true and the wish didn't. George got his name up. Of course he did. He ended up in Little House in the big woods, read aloud in millions of homes for the better part of a century, one of the most encountered uncles in the history of American storytelling. By any measure a Burnett County farmer could have imagined, George Ingalls got his name up beyond his wildest grinning hope, and not one person who read it ever met him. They met the costume. They met the drummer boy, the bugle, the swagger, the warm blur at the edge of the dance. The name went up and the man stayed buried. He got the fame and lost the self in the same stroke, which is its own particular kind of erasure, not being forgotten, but being remembered as someone you never were. There's a grief that doesn't have a common name, so let me give it one, because George is the perfect case of it. It's the grief of being remembered wrong. 2. We're all afraid of being forgotten. That fear is easy and we talk about it all the time. But there's a colder thing underneath it, and that's the fear of being remembered as a thing you weren't, of having your one real life sanded down into a convenient shape for somebody else's better story, and then handed to the future as the truth. George didn't vanish. That would almost have been kinder. George got preserved in amber, in a children's book, as a man who never existed. The ferryman, the father of dead children, the husband of a woman in an asylum, the witness, the joker coughing his liver out, all of that got left out, and a bugle got left in. So here is what we did tonight, and it's the only thing a channel like this can do, and it's small, but it isn't nothing. We gave him his name back. Not the name up in lights, he already had that, and it was the wrong man, the other name, the real one. George Whiting Ingalls, born 1851, 9th of 10, the brother who stayed home. The man who crossed the same water back and forth while his brother crossed the world. The husband who buried every child he made. The man who walked a mile through the snow to his brother's table because it was the only warm room left in his life. The dying man who measured his coffin miles and decided to keep smiling. The witness, always the witness, standing just outside the great events of his time, close enough to swear to them, never once allowed inside. That man, the true one. For one night, in a few hundred dark rooms, that's the George who got remembered, not the drummer boy. Him. And I think, I can't prove this, it's the narrator talking again, but I think that if George could have chosen, he'd have taken this over the bugle, the real grief over the pretty lie, the true small life over the false large one, because the line he actually left us, the one in his own hand, isn't a brag about a war. It's a quiet, stubborn, smiling refusal to disappear. I will get my name up yet if I keep on smiling. He kept smiling. Right to the end, the diary says, he kept smiling. It just took 125 years for anyone to say his actual name back to him. Which brings us back, the way these things always do, to the bugle, to the sound he blew into the woods, and the sound that came back. Because now, only now, with everything we know, can we finally hear what that scene was really about. Go back to the big woods one last time. The night of the dance. The supper is over, the fiddle has gone quiet, and a young man steps out the door into the snow with an army bugle in his hand. We know him now. We know he never carried that bugle to any war. We know the war happened to his brothers and went around him. We know that in a few years he'll marry a girl from Michigan, and that they'll have children, and that the children will die, every one, including the one who lived a year and smothered in the blankets. We know his wife will be taken to Mendota, and then to a place the state calls Chronic, and that she'll die there, alone, 60 miles from wherever they put him. We know he'll cough his way through his 40s on a swamp claim between Mud Lake and Devil's Lake, joking about his liver, kept alive by the one brother who wouldn't leave. We know he'll die at 49 in a grave his brother had to give him the ground for. We know all of it now, standing here in the snow watching a young man we finally understand. And he lifts the bugle and he blows. The sound goes out long and loud over the frozen trees. And then the part Laura remembered, the part millions of children fell asleep on, the sound comes back. Thin and clear and small, she wrote. Like a little bugle answering the big one. And George turns. This man the world will spend a century misunderstanding. And he says, listen, isn't that pretty? There was no other bugle. You understood that the moment I said it, hours ago, and you've carried it through everything since. The answer from the woods was an echo. It was George's own call, thrown back at him by trees that did not know him and did not care, returning thinner and smaller than it left. A man stood alone at the edge of the dark and blew a soldier's call he had no right to, and what answered him was a reduced copy of himself. That is the whole life. That is George Ingalls in one image, and the terrible grace of it is that he handed it to us himself, in the warmest scene he ever appears in, and nobody looked. He spent his years sending things out into the dark. A bugle call, a marriage, child after child, a homestead claim, a name he hoped to get up if he just kept smiling, and what came back was always smaller than what he sent. The babies came back as graves, the wife came back as paperwork, the claim came back as a borrowed plot. The name came back as somebody else's costume. Everything George Ingalls ever blew into the dark returned to him thinner, like a little bugle answering the big one. And then Laura did it one more time, the biggest time, the time that lasted. He sent his real life out into the world, the way we all do, hoping it would be received. And what the world got back was an echo of him, thinner, prettier, smaller, easier to love. A drummer boy instead of a ferryman, a bugle instead of a cough, a wild young veteran instead of a man who buried his children. The books took the big sound of an entire human life and handed back a little clear, pretty version of it. And for 90 years, everyone agreed that the echo was the man. We came in tonight asking why she did it. Why the most trusted voice in American childhood gave her uncle a war he never fought. And we have the answer now, and the answer is not villainy, and it is not quite kindness either. She did it because the real George could not fit inside a warm book, and because a borrowed war was the only thing left to give a man the world had given nothing to, and because the made-up version was easier to love and easier to sell in a decade when love and money were both running short. She did it the way families always do it, gently, with affection, sealing the unbearable truth under a charming lie, and then setting the lie down so softly on top of the truth that the truth went quiet underneath and stayed quiet for 4 generations. The most thorough way to bury a man, it turns out, is not to forget him. It's to remember him beautifully and wrong. So here, at the end, is the one thing we can actually do, and we've done it. We can't give George his children. We can't empty the asylum or cure the cough or hand him the deed to land that finally holds. We can't trade him his brother's legend for the footnote he got instead. But we can stand at the edge of the dark with him one more time, and this time, when he blows the bugle and the small thin echo comes back and he turns and asks if it isn't pretty this time, somebody knows it's him. This time the echo has a name. George Whiting Ingalls. Born 1851. Died 1901. The brother who stayed home. The one the war went around. The man whose whole life came back to him smaller than he sent it until tonight. He blew a call into the dark, and for 125 years the only thing that answered was a thinner copy of himself. It isn't anymore. Sleep well. We'll find another one tomorrow night. Another name the bright story used for scenery. Another person waiting in the files for somebody to finally come and read them back into being. There are more of them than there are of us. That's the whole point. Good night.